The bar was quiet for a small-town establishment, save for the occasional clink of glass and the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. The lights were dim, casting long shadows over the well-worn wooden tables and the rough-hewn bar, where a few regulars sat, nursing their drinks. A handful of bikers gathered in a huddle near the back, talking in loud voices, occasionally erupting into raucous laughter. Their presence was imposing, and the low murmurs of the rest of the patrons indicated a certain unease that lingered in the air. Mariah had heard of this place before, a local dive where the bikers often hung out, but she never thought much of it. She had never been one to shy away from any place simply because of its reputation, especially not a place where she could grab a drink and gather her thoughts. So she walked in. At first glance, she could tell that the atmosphere was tense, but she wasn't here to make trouble. She just wanted to have a quiet moment, far away from the noise of the world. Her heels clicked on the wooden floor as she made her way to the bar. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, and suddenly the eyes of the room shifted toward her. It was that unmistakable, almost visceral feeling of being observed. Mariah ignored it. She didn't let their gaze faze her. She had learned long ago that looking the part, confident, unfazed, was half the battle. As she approached the bar, a few murmurs rippled through the crowd. There was something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, that commanded attention. Mariah wasn't particularly tall, but she carried herself with such grace, such authority, that she immediately became the center of attention without even trying. Then, she saw him, the man who would change the course of her evening. Hank, a biker with a reputation for being one of the roughest in the group. His leather vest, covered in patches and worn from years of use, was a symbol of his brashness. The tattoos that marked his arms spoke of a life lived on the edge, a life of violence and recklessness. His eyes locked onto Mariah as she reached for a stool at the bar. "Hey there, sweetheart," he slurred, leaning in a little too close. His voice was gruff, thick with the arrogance that came from years of getting away with things. "Why don't you come sit with me? You look like you're alone." Mariah didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the rudeness in his tone. Instead, she calmly ordered her drink and took a seat at the bar, as far away from the bikers as she could manage. She was used to attention, used to people thinking they could control the situation with their words, but Mariah wasn't that easy. Hank, however, wasn't used to being ignored. He wasn't used to anyone dismissing him. He was a king in this small town, feared and admired in equal measure. And when Mariah didn't so much as give him the time of day, it irritated him. His ego, bruised by her silence, pushed him into action. "Don't ignore me, girl," he growled, rising from his seat. His friends watched, eyes narrowing with interest, curious about how this would play out. Hank wasn't one to take rejection kindly. Mariah still didn't respond, but she could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, the subtle shift of the room as Hank advanced toward her. He was already standing over her, towering like a shadow over her small figure, his broad chest blocking out most of the dim light. Then, in a moment of pure arrogance, Hank reached out and slapped her cheek. It was a loud, sharp sound that cut through the air like a whip crack. The force of the slap caused Mariah to slightly sway in her seat, but she didn't cry out, didn't flinch. Instead, she simply turned her head back to face him. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his smirk falter for just a split second. The bar went completely silent. Even the jukebox stopped as if the world had frozen, waiting for her reaction. The bikers, who had once been so confident in their numbers, now seemed unsure of what to do. Mariah didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She just looked at Hank. It was in that moment that the room began to realize something. Hank had just underestimated her. Mariah slowly placed her glass down, the ice clinking softly against the side, her gaze never leaving his. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel fear. What she felt was a quiet, calm clarity. A clarity that came from knowing she had nothing to prove. She was not here for a confrontation, but she would not allow herself to be treated like less than she was. And she would make sure that Hank understood that. Hank, though, wasn't done. He expected a reaction from her. He expected her to either cower or fight back in some desperate attempt to defend herself. But when she did neither, it confused him. A small knot of doubt began to form in his mind. What kind of woman could take a slap like that and not react? He had faced down men twice his size who had crumbled under the weight of his intimidation. But Mariah wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, narrowing his eyes. You gonna just stand there, girl? You gonna let me get away with that? His voice was lower now, but it was tinged with an edge that was more out of uncertainty than anger. He wanted her to react, wanted to see her break, but she didn't. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a single word. She just sat there silently, her posture as straight as the bar stool she was perched upon. Mariah's eyes never left his, and for the first time that night, the bikers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The power had shifted, and they could feel it. Hank's friends, who had initially laughed and egged him on, now began to look away, unsure of how to respond to the sudden tension that filled the air. It was clear to them now. Mariah wasn't a woman to be trifled with. She wasn't playing the game by their rules. She wasn't here to be humiliated, and in that moment, as the silence stretched on, the entire room held its breath. The only sound now was the faint echo of the jukebox playing in the distance. Mariah's calm in the face of such provocation was the first crack in Hank's armor, and the beginning of a confrontation that none of them could have predicted. The tension in the room could be sliced with a knife, and for a long moment, no one moved. Mariah remained still, her eyes fixed on Hank's, unwavering and steady. The bikers' grins had faded, replaced by a sense of confusion that now hung in the air. What was supposed to be an easy show of dominance had turned into something neither side had expected. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor broke the silence as one of Hank's friends shifted uneasily in his seat. The others watched as the situation unfolded before them, each one uncertain about what would come next. Hank, however, was not used to this feeling. His entire life he had been the one to take control of every room he entered. His size, his reputation, the confidence he projected, all of it worked in his favor. It had always been easy for him to make people uncomfortable, to make them feel small. But Mariah, sitting there like a still storm not backing down, was unsettling in a way he hadn't experienced before. He had expected her to lash out, to get angry, but instead there was only calm. And that calm, so composed, so collected, was a threat to everything he had built himself to be. For a brief second, Hank considered backing off, walking away, leaving the situation to simmer down. But that wasn't who he was. Hank was not a man who walked away. Not now, not after what had just happened. His pride burned like fire in his chest, demanding satisfaction. He wasn't going to let a woman, especially not one like her, make a fool of him. Not in front of his boys, not in front of anyone. With a grunt, Hank stepped forward again, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. He loomed over her, trying to use his physicality to intimidate her. But still, Mariah didn't flinch. Her hands rested casually on her lap, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze still unwavering. "Don't think you've won, girl," he growled, his voice low and rough. "I can slap you again and you'll take it just like you took the first one." The words hung in the air, thick with a challenge that Mariah could feel deep in her chest. But she didn't respond, not with words. Her silence was more powerful than anything she could say. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't looking for a fight. But she wasn't going to let him or anyone think that they could control her. She didn't need to argue or shout. She just needed to be. Hank took another step forward, his chest swelling with anger. The space between them shrank, and now the air felt thick and suffocating. For a moment, Mariah thought he might strike again, but instead he hesitated. There was something about her that seemed to stop him in his tracks. She wasn't scared. She wasn't intimidated. And that was something Hank wasn't used to. The room seemed to close in around them. The sounds of glasses clinking and conversations muttering in the background faded into a dull hum. It was just the two of them now, locked in this strange standoff. The bikers, once so eager to watch the show unfold, were now growing uncomfortable. They shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, uncertain of how to react. Mariah's calm had thrown them off. They couldn't read her, and that, more than anything, made them uneasy. Mariah's gaze remained fixed on Hank, but there was something deeper behind her eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something more primal, an understanding of who she was, of what she could do. Hank was loud. He was brash. He was used to getting his way, to forcing people to bend to his will. But Mariah was not that person. She was someone who stood her ground, someone who knew exactly what she was capable of, and she was in control of this moment, whether Hank realized it or not. The air in the room grew heavier as Hank stood there, unsure of how to proceed. For all his size, all his strength, he had nothing left to rely on in this moment. He had no words, no threats, no easy way out. His arrogance, which had always been his weapon, now seemed futile. And in that stillness, Mariah's presence felt almost suffocating, her quiet power emanating like an invisible force that pushed back against his every move. Finally, Hank spoke, his voice now tinged with something darker, something desperate. "What, you think you're better than me? You think you can stand there and look at me like you're in charge? You think I'm just going to let you get away with this?" The question hung in the air, but Mariah didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was her answer. And in that silence, something changed. Hank was no longer sure of himself. He was no longer the predator. He was the one being hunted. Hank's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. The room was still quiet, save for the faint sound of Hank's ragged breathing. He was a man used to controlling the situation, used to being the one who dictated the pace. But this was different. Mariah was not a victim. She was not someone to be controlled. She could feel the shift, the moment when Hank's confidence began to crack. It was small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but she could feel it. It was the same feeling she had experienced countless times before, when people underestimated her, when they saw only her skin and not her strength. She had learned long ago that it wasn't about proving anything to others. It was about showing them quietly that they had no power over her. Mariah stood up slowly without rushing. She didn't look away from Hank, but there was no anger in her eyes. There was only calm, only certainty. As she rose from her seat, the room seemed to hold its breath, watching, waiting. And in that moment, Hank took a small step back, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one in control. Mariah's eyes never left his, her steps measured and slow. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to make any grand gesture. All she needed to do was walk past him, past the others, and show them once and for all that she was not someone to be trifled with. Her power wasn't in her physicality, wasn't in the loudness of her voice or the aggression of her stance. Her power was in her ability to remain steady, to stay calm when the world around her wanted to explode. As she passed Hank, her shoulder brushed against his, a quiet touch that carried more weight than any punch ever could. The bikers watched, their eyes wide with shock, and for the first time the energy in the room shifted. It was no longer about who could dominate the other. It was about respect, and Mariah had just shown them what real respect looked like. Without another word, she walked to the door, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence, leaving behind the men who had underestimated her, and for the first time in a long time they were left to reflect, not on what they had done to her, but on what she had done to them. The streets outside the bar were cool, and the night air carried the scent of rain, though it hadn't yet arrived. Mariah walked through the dim light, her steps purposeful, her head held high. The sound of the door to the bar closing behind her was faint, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like a fog. She could still hear Hank's voice in her mind, his crude words, his taunts. She could still feel the sting of the slap on her cheek, though it wasn't the physical pain that echoed inside her. It was the realization of how far people would go to impose their will on someone else. And yet Mariah had shown him and the rest of the bar something they hadn't expected: strength. As she walked down the street, she heard the distant rumble of motorcycles, the unmistakable roar of the bikers as they made their way out of the bar. Hank and his crew were undoubtedly on their way somewhere else, looking for trouble, trying to find their next conquest. She couldn't help but wonder if they'd learned anything tonight. It wasn't about the physical confrontation, about the slap or the fall. It was about how people, when pushed far enough, had the ability to show a strength they didn't even know they possessed. It was about how even the quietest person, the one who didn't scream or lash out, could possess an immense power when they refused to let themselves be broken. Mariah had never been the type to scream for attention. She wasn't loud in her defiance. She didn't need to be. She had learned a long time ago that silence often held more weight than words. In the face of aggression, in the face of violence, it was the stillness of her resolve that had stopped Hank in his tracks. And as she walked down the empty street, she realized that it wasn't the bikers who had the power. It was her. The weight of the moment settled over her as she continued on her way, her pace steady. She wasn't running away. She wasn't leaving behind a fight. No, she was walking forward, letting the night take her wherever it might. And in that moment, she knew that what had just happened in the bar wasn't just a victory over Hank. It was a victory over every moment of her life when someone had tried to make her feel small, to make her feel less than. And it was a victory she carried with her, not as a badge of honor, but as a quiet understanding of her own worth. The streets were quiet, but not silent. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its voice echoing off the buildings. A car passed, its headlights briefly lighting up the sidewalk before fading into the distance. Mariah didn't rush. She wasn't afraid of the dark, nor was she afraid of the silence that surrounded her. She embraced it, felt it settle around her like a cloak. The world didn't owe her anything, and neither did Hank, no matter how much he thought he could take from her. Back at the bar, the bikers had begun to talk. Hank's ego had been bruised, and in his prideful attempts to shake off the sting, he had convinced himself that Mariah was nothing more than a fluke, a brief interruption in his world. But as he and his friends rode off into the night, the nagging feeling that something had shifted lingered with him. It wasn't something he could quite put his finger on, but it was there, tugging at the back of his mind. In a way, Mariah had done the one thing Hank could never understand. She had made him feel powerless. And that was the one thing he couldn't handle. His entire life had been built on dominance, on showing the world that he was the one in control, the one everyone feared. But Mariah hadn't feared him. She hadn't played by his rules. She had rewritten the script altogether, and in doing so had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about power. As the night wore on, the rain began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The steady patter of the droplets against the pavement was soothing, almost rhythmic. Mariah kept walking, letting the rain wash over her. It wasn't the first time she had faced adversity, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But each time she became stronger. She had faced hardships throughout her life, more than most people could imagine, and with each one, she had learned to rise above, to stand taller, to fight quieter but more fiercely. And now, as the rain softened the world around her, she realized that her journey was far from over. What had happened in the bar tonight, what had happened with Hank and the bikers, wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for something greater, the right to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And sometimes the loudest way to demand respect was simply by being yourself, unshaken, unwavering, and unafraid. By the time Mariah reached the small, run-down apartment she called home, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle, and took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She wasn't afraid of the consequences. The bikers, Hank, none of them mattered. What mattered was that she had walked away from the night with her head held high, her spirit intact. That was all she needed. The world would never stop trying to make people like her bend, make them break, but that wasn't the life she had chosen. She didn't bow to anyone's expectations, didn't conform to anyone's ideals. She made her own way, found her own path, and along the way she found a power that was hers alone to wield. The bikers had thought they could push her down, make her crumble under their force. But what they hadn't realized was that they weren't dealing with someone who was easily swayed, someone who could be intimidated into submission. Mariah was someone who had learned to stand on her own 2 feet no matter what anyone else thought. She was someone who could walk into a room full of strangers, full of people who looked down on her, and still leave with her head held high, knowing that she had nothing to prove to them. That strength, that quiet power was hers to keep. She stepped inside her apartment, leaving the rain and the night behind her. The sound of the rain against the windows was calming now, almost meditative. Mariah took off her coat and hung it on the back of the door. She glanced at the mirror across the room, catching her reflection in the dim light. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness. There was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had faced the challenge and had risen above it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, new people who would try to make her feel less than, but she knew now more than ever that no one could ever take away her power. Not Hank, not anyone. And that more than anything was what made her unshakable. The following days passed by quietly for Mariah. The rainstorm from the night she had left the bar had washed the streets clean, leaving behind a fresh, crisp smell in the air. But in the days that followed, it wasn't the scent of rain or the lingering chill that occupied her thoughts. It was the subtle shift in the way the world around her moved, how it seemed to bend just slightly under the weight of her actions. Mariah had never been one to seek attention, and yet it had found her. Hank and his crew had been a force she hadn't anticipated. but she had faced them head-on and walked away unbroken. She had never been one for confrontation, preferring instead to live in the quiet spaces, in the places where people didn't see her unless they really looked. But that night had changed something. It had ignited a fire she hadn't realized was there, one that would burn slowly, steadily, until it shaped everything in its path. The day after the bar incident, Mariah's phone rang. She had been sitting at her small kitchen table, sipping coffee and lost in thought. It was rare for her to get calls, and she had long ago stopped wondering why. The world seemed content to forget about her unless it needed something, until something like Hank happened. The phone's ring cut through her quiet morning, and she glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her finger hovering over the screen. Was it one of Hank's friends? Was it someone from the bar? Or was it someone else? Someone who had witnessed what had happened and had something to say about it. She had no idea. Hello? The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, but there was something in the tone that made her feel uneasy. Is this Mariah? It is, she replied cautiously. I'm Detective Carter, the voice said, identifying itself. I'm calling regarding an incident that occurred at the Rusty Spur Bar 2 nights ago. You're probably aware of what I'm referring to. Mariah's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, thinking back to the events. She had known this was coming. Had known that someone would come knocking, that the bikers would make sure there were consequences for what had happened. She'd never intended for it to go this far, but in some strange way she wasn't surprised that it had. Yes, I'm aware, she said, trying to keep her voice even, calm. Is there something I can help you with? There was a brief pause on the line before Detective Carter spoke again. We've received reports that Hank and some of his friends are looking to make a scene about what happened that night. They're angry, Mariah. I need to know if you feel threatened by them. If you feel that you're in danger. Mariah took a breath, steadying herself. She had anticipated this call. She had been expecting it, and yet, hearing it confirmed out loud felt different. The incident hadn't just been a fleeting moment of aggression. It had turned into something bigger, something with ripples she couldn't control. No, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence. I don't feel threatened. I'm not afraid of Hank or anyone else. Detective Carter let out a small sigh as if she were relieved to hear the words. That's good to know. But we are keeping an eye on things. If you need anything, if you feel unsafe at any time, you let us know. I will, Mariah replied, though part of her knew that the call was more of a formality than anything else. It wasn't the police who could protect her from Hank or his crew. It was herself, and she had already proven that she could handle them. As she hung up the phone, Mariah couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settle back over her. The world hadn't let her walk away without consequences. There would be whispers, there would be rumors, and there would be people who would view her differently because of what happened. But what was most unsettling, what unsettled her more than anything, was the nagging thought that Hank wouldn't let it go. He wouldn't forget what she had done. Over the next few days, things remained quiet. The storm passed, and with it, the initial rush of attention faded. But there was a subtle shift in the air, a change that Mariah couldn't ignore. As she went about her daily life, running errands, going to work, stopping by the small grocery store, the people she passed on the street seemed to look at her differently. There were no overt glances, no whispered conversations, but there was something in the way they regarded her, something that lingered in the background. She began to notice the shift, the way people took just a little bit longer to look at her, the way their eyes seemed to linger on her just a little longer than they used to. It was subtle, but it was there, and it made her feel uncomfortable. At work, her colleagues, most of whom she had known for years, started treating her with a certain deference she wasn't used to. They spoke more carefully around her, laughed a little less loudly. It wasn't a change she had asked for, but it was there, and she didn't know how to handle it. It was as if the incident at the bar had somehow given her a new status, a new sense of authority she hadn't wanted. But now it was hers, whether she liked it or not. As the days passed, Hank's absence became more apparent. His usual hangouts, the places where he and his friends would go to cause trouble, were quieter. His bike was no longer parked outside the bar where he had once been a constant presence. The rumors of his anger, his need to reclaim his pride, seemed to dissipate. But Mariah knew better than to think it was over. The storm had passed, yes, but the aftermath was still in motion. It wasn't until a week later, while she was walking home from work, that she saw him. Hank. He was standing on the sidewalk across the street, just outside the alleyway that led to the back of the bar. His eyes locked onto hers from a distance, and for a moment time seemed to slow. His face was expressionless, but there was something in his gaze, something cold, something calculating, that sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was simply watching her. Mariah's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She didn't cross the street to avoid him. She simply stood there, her feet rooted to the ground, staring back. The world around them seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them locked in that silent moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Hank turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Mariah stood there for a moment longer, her pulse racing, before she slowly exhaled. She wasn't afraid. She hadn't been before, and she wasn't now. The shift in power wasn't about the fall in the bar, nor the words Hank had thrown at her. It wasn't about the physical confrontation. It was about the quiet, unspoken understanding that had passed between them. It was about the recognition of strength, not his, but hers. And though Hank might not have realized it, the shift had already occurred. She had won not by force, but by standing firm, by simply being herself. The rain had stopped, leaving only the aftermath, the remnants of its presence shimmering on the street like forgotten secrets. The night seemed quieter, the silence now bearing the weight of days that had passed since Hank's encounter with Mariah. But the truth was, no amount of time could erase what had happened in that bar. No amount of distance could scrub away the memory of the slap, the fall, or the sudden realization that things had changed, not just for her, but for everyone involved. Mariah hadn't been one to chase after recognition. She wasn't a person who sought out validation or applause, but as the days wore on, she found herself increasingly aware of the shift around her. People were different. The world looked at her differently now. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that bar a week ago. No one would ever see her the same way again. She couldn't walk into her local store without noticing the glances, the way the clerk would ring up her items a little too quickly, or how her neighbors suddenly seemed more polite, more distant. It wasn't the kindness that unsettled her. It was the way people now regarded her, as if they knew something about her that she didn't. It wasn't the stares of admiration either. It was something more complicated. They looked at her with a sense of caution, with a kind of reverence that she wasn't sure she deserved. But she couldn't change it. She didn't want to change it. The way people saw her now wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the quiet storm she was feeling within herself. Mariah had always been someone who prided herself on keeping her emotions in check, on not letting the world bend her. She had learned long ago that strength wasn't about showing the world your scars. It was about carrying them without letting them define you. But in the aftermath of that night, something inside her was shifting, something she wasn't sure how to control. That night, when she had left the bar and walked into the rain, she had believed that her actions had been decisive, that they had settled something within her. But now, standing at the crossroads of her life, she realized she had been wrong. The events hadn't ended with Hank's fall. No, they had only just begun. Days passed and the unease within her grew. The quiet attention she received from people, whether it was in the store, on the street, or at work, didn't feel like admiration. It felt like something else. It felt like fear. People were afraid of her now. Not in a physical sense, but in a psychological one. They knew she was capable of something they couldn't understand. They knew she was a force they didn't want to face, and that frightened them. Mariah was no longer just the woman in the background, the one who kept to herself and stayed unnoticed. Now she was a symbol. And symbols, she realized, were dangerous things. They could inspire admiration, yes, but they could also breed contempt. They could make enemies out of those who didn't understand what you stood for. Or worse, they could turn you into a target for those who wanted to prove that they were still in control. And then there was Hank. She hadn't seen him since their brief encounter on the street, but she knew he was watching her. She could feel his presence in the quiet moments of her day, in the shadows that seemed to follow her every move. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't let go of what had happened, and she knew it wouldn't be long before he came looking for answers. Hank was a man who couldn't stand being undermined. And in the space between their last encounter and now, Mariah could feel the brewing storm, the tension that was still hanging in the air, waiting to crack wide open. Her thoughts wandered back to that night in the bar, to the moment when the slap landed and how everything had shifted in the blink of an eye. She hadn't expected Hank to strike her. She hadn't expected him to test her like that. But the fact that he had, and the fact that she had stood her ground, changed something within her. It had woken something she hadn't known was there. A part of her that was no longer willing to be silent. A part of her that was no longer willing to be unseen. Mariah had lived a life where silence was her refuge. She had learned early on that the quieter you were, the less attention you attracted, the less noise you made, the easier it was to slip by unnoticed. But silence, she realized now, was a double-edged sword. It could protect you, yes, but it could also keep you hidden from the world. And that was the thing she had been running from all along, the fear of remaining invisible, the fear of being forgotten. But that was no longer her reality. And so, she found herself at the edge of something new, something she hadn't anticipated. A crossroads where she could either step into the unknown or retreat back into the quiet life she had known before Hank and his crew came into the picture. But the truth was, retreat wasn't an option. She could feel the pull of the moment, the way her life had begun to bend in a new direction. The phone rang again, the sound cutting through her thoughts, pulling her out of her reverie. It was the same number as before, the detective. Mariah hesitated, but only for a second, before picking up the receiver. This time there was no formality, no small talk. The conversation was direct. "We've received reports." Detective Carter's voice was crisp, professional, but there was an underlying tension in it that wasn't there before. "There are people who are starting to ask questions, Mariah. People who want to know what really happened that night. People who think Hank is the victim here. I'm afraid this isn't over." Mariah's stomach tightened. She had known this was coming, but hearing it from the detective made it real. Hank wasn't just angry. He was planning something. He wouldn't let this lie. "I'm fine," Mariah replied, her voice firm, though a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. "There's nothing for him to say that I haven't already heard. I'm not worried about him." But she knew deep down that she was lying to herself. Hank was the kind of man who didn't let things go. He would come after her again, and this time he wouldn't stop until he had reclaimed his pride. Mariah could feel it. He was out there, waiting, plotting, like a shadow that never quite left her side. "I'm just letting you know that we're keeping an eye on things," the detective said. "But I need you to be careful. If anything happens, don't hesitate to reach out." Mariah didn't respond immediately. The words echoed in her mind, but she didn't feel reassured. The truth was, she had never really needed anyone's help before. She had always relied on herself to get through the tough times. The quiet battles she fought within herself were far harder than anything Hank or anyone else could throw at her. And it was those battles that had shaped her into the woman she was now. She ended the call, her hand still gripping the phone. The world outside her window was dark, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. But even in the calm of the night, Mariah could feel the storm coming. And this time, it wouldn't be the kind of storm she could walk away from. This time it would follow her wherever she went. The question was no longer whether she could face Hank. The question was whether she could face the version of herself that had been awakened by the slap, by the fall, by the power that now surged through her veins. Because that power was hers to wield, and in the end it was the only thing she could rely on. She had changed. And now it was time to see just how far that change would take her. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, and Mariah felt the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She had known this moment was coming. She had known from the first time Hank had slapped her that things wouldn't be the same, but she hadn't known just how much she would change because of it. That night, something inside her had snapped, and it wasn't just the physical sting of his slap. It was the realization that she had allowed herself to be invisible for far too long, allowing others to define her, to decide what she was worth. Hank had been the catalyst, but the truth was, the real battle had been with herself. As the days turned into weeks, Mariah had tried to return to her normal life, but it felt like everything had shifted. It was as though she had walked into a new version of herself, one that she didn't fully recognize. People were different now. Their eyes lingered a little too long on her, their smiles too polite, their words measured. She couldn't walk through the grocery store without sensing the subtle shifts in how people interacted with her. It wasn't admiration that she felt. It was a kind of quiet fear. They saw her differently now. They didn't see just the woman who had walked into the bar that night. They saw someone who had stood up to the bikers, someone who had taken control in a way they didn't understand. They didn't know how to categorize her, so they avoided her, treating her with a wariness that stung more than any insult ever could. But it wasn't just the way people treated her that was shifting. It was the way she treated herself. She had never been one to feel self-doubt, but now she found herself questioning everything. She wasn't just worried about Hank or what might happen if he came after her. She was worried about what might happen to her if she kept walking down this path. The path of strength, the path of defiance. It wasn't a path that was easy to follow. She had lived her life in quiet grace and silence. But now she was a symbol, and symbols, whether good or bad, were never without consequence. Mariah had told herself she wasn't afraid of Hank, that she could handle him. But as the days wore on, she began to wonder if she was fooling herself. Hank wasn't just angry. He was relentless. He didn't let go of things easily. He had always been the king of the streets, the man who ruled with fists and intimidation. Mariah had shown him that she wouldn't bow to that. But that didn't mean he wouldn't come back harder. And then one evening, it happened. She was walking home from work when she saw him again. Hank. His silhouette loomed in the dimming light, and for a moment she thought she might be imagining it. But no, it was him. He was leaning against a lamppost, his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable. Mariah's heart beat in her chest, a rapid thrum of adrenaline. She knew this was coming. She had known from the moment their eyes had met across the street that day that this wasn't over. But now, standing there face to face with him, she wasn't sure what to do. She had always been the one to walk away, the one to leave things behind. But Hank wasn't going to let her walk away this time. He wasn't going to let her leave it in the past. You think you can just walk away from this? Hank's voice was low, cold, and it sent a shiver through Mariah. He stepped forward, closing the gap between them with a slow, deliberate pace. You think I'm just going to forget what you did? Forget how you embarrassed me in front of everyone? Mariah's breath hitched. She felt the air around her grow thick, the tension crackling like static. But she didn't back away. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze with the same calm resolve she had shown the night he'd slapped her. I'm not going anywhere, Hank, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm not going to apologize for standing up for myself. He sneered, taking another step closer, his presence overpowering. You think you're better than me, don't you? You think you can just walk in here and make a fool of me and I'm supposed to take it? Mariah's jaw tightened. She had faced down worse than this. She had faced down people who didn't want her to succeed. People who thought she was nothing more than a blip in their world. She had faced discrimination, judgment, and more than one attempt to tear her down. But here, with Hank, it was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the woman she was becoming. For the woman who refused to be silenced. Who refused to let anyone take her power away. No. Hank, she said, her voice growing firmer, the words sharp like a blade. I don't think I'm better than you. I think I'm stronger than you. And I'm not afraid of you. He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the quiet street. But there was something different in his eyes now. It wasn't just anger. It was a kind of confusion. As if he didn't quite understand what was happening. He had always been the one in control. He had always been the one to make people fear him. But Mariah wasn't afraid, and that shook him more than anything else. Hank took another step, his hand rising as if he was going to strike her again. But this time Mariah was ready. She had prepared for this moment, not physically but emotionally. She had learned that real strength wasn't in how hard you could hit back. It was in knowing when not to engage. It was in standing firm, even when the world around you tried to push you down. She stepped to the side, avoiding his outstretched hand, and in one fluid motion she grabbed his wrist, twisting it with precise force. The action was quick, unexpected, and before he could react, she had him off balance. His face twisted in shock, his body teetering as he stumbled backward. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Hank, the man who had terrorized everyone, the one who had always been in control, was now on the ground, looking up at her in disbelief. Mariah stood over him, her breathing steady, her eyes cold and clear. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. Hank lay there, his pride shattered, his anger still burning in his chest. But it was a different kind of anger now. It wasn't the anger of someone who had power. It was the anger of someone who had just realized he had lost. Mariah turned and walked away. the sounds of Hank's curses fading into the distance behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had faced him. She had faced her fear, and she had won. The world hadn't changed overnight. The whispers still followed her. The gazes still lingered, but there was a peace inside her now. A quiet satisfaction that she had never felt before. She wasn't just walking through life anymore. She was living it. She was owning it. And she had made it clear that no one, not even Hank, could take that from her. Mariah had found her strength. And now no one would ever be able to make her doubt it again. The weeks that followed Hank's defeat were both calm and unnerving for Mariah. The dust from the storm that had swept through her life had started to settle, but the reverberations of that night, the strength she had summoned from within, continued to echo through her world in subtle ways. The physical confrontation with Hank had been the final test, the final moment of reckoning. But it was what came after, the quiet moments of reflection, the space between one battle and the next, that truly shaped the woman she had become. Mariah wasn't sure if she had expected everything to go back to normal once the dust had settled. She wasn't sure if she had expected life to suddenly fall into place the way it once had. It was naive, perhaps, to believe that something as simple as a fight would resolve the deeper currents that had always defined her existence. But that was exactly what had happened. She had expected the world to be easier, to ease her into this new version of herself, but instead she had found something more complicated. She had discovered that strength, true strength, wasn't something that came from overcoming others. It came from learning to stand firm, to hold her ground when everything around her wanted to knock her down. The change wasn't just internal. It rippled through the world around her too. People noticed. They didn't just look at her differently. They acted differently toward her. Her coworkers were still polite, still hesitant to engage with her as they once had. But there was no longer a barrier between them. They had started to recognize her in a new light, not as the quiet woman who kept to herself, but as someone who had power, someone who could stand tall in a world that demanded compliance. It wasn't always a comfortable transition. There were moments when she felt alienated, moments when the weight of her newfound authority felt more like a burden than a gift. But in those moments when she doubted herself, she remembered what had happened at the bar. She remembered the strength she had found within her when she stood tall against Hank, when she refused to let him define her. It wasn't just her coworkers who treated her differently. The people on the street, the ones who had once looked at her with indifference, now saw her with a quiet respect. The little things, like the way people held doors open for her or the way the barista at her local coffee shop now greeted her with a smile, were no longer just gestures of politeness. They were marks of something more profound. She had become a symbol, but it wasn't a symbol she had ever asked for. It was something that had grown around her, something that others had imposed upon her whether she wanted it or not. Mariah wasn't sure if she liked it. She wasn't sure if she liked being seen as someone who could never be broken, someone who had faced down the hardest of challenges and come out on top. There was a quiet part of her that longed for simplicity, for the days when she could simply fade into the background and escape the weight of others' expectations. But there was no going back now. The woman she had been before Hank, before the slap, before the fall, was gone. She had been remade in that moment. She had transformed not just physically but emotionally, spiritually. She had faced herself in the mirror and had seen something there, something stronger, something sharper that she hadn't realized she was capable of. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the cool breeze from the city streets slipped through the open window, Mariah sat in her apartment reflecting on the journey that had led her to this point. The world outside was still, the hum of the city a faint background noise. She sat on her couch staring at the wall across from her, lost in thought. The memories of Hank, of his aggression, his cruelty, no longer haunted her. They had faded into something distant, something she could look at and accept without regret. She had faced him and she had won. But it wasn't the victory that had stayed with her. It was the quiet realization that victory wasn't always about defeating your enemy. It was about learning to stand on your own, about proving to yourself that you were enough regardless of who was watching or who was waiting for you to fail. The phone rang, pulling her out of her reverie. It was the detective again. Her heart gave a small flutter, though she couldn't say why. It had been a while since their last conversation, and she hadn't expected to hear from her again. She picked up the phone, ready for whatever news might come. "Mariah, it's Detective Carter," the voice on the other end of the line began, calm and professional, as always. "I wanted to check in with you, see how you're doing after everything. We've heard that Hank has moved on, but we've also heard a few rumors. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Mariah sighed, running a hand through her hair as she looked out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight cast shadows on the sidewalk below. She could hear the bustle of life outside her window, the sound of people talking, the distant hum of cars passing by. It was a stark contrast to the quiet space she had found in herself. "I'm fine, Detective," she said, her voice steady. "I've handled things. It's over." The detective paused for a moment before responding. "I'm glad to hear that. Just know if you ever need anything, we're still here." Mariah didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure if she needed anyone anymore. She had learned to rely on herself, and that, more than anything, was what had brought her peace. It wasn't about the police or the people around her. It was about the fact that she had learned to stand alone. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft. "I appreciate it." As she hung up the phone, a strange sense of finality washed over her. The detective's call had marked the last loose thread in her life. The fear that Hank had instilled in her, the uncertainty about what might happen next, was gone. The fight, the struggle, it was all in the past. And now she could begin to move forward, not as the woman who had survived, but as the woman who had emerged from the fire stronger, with nothing left to prove. Mariah stood up from the couch, stretching her arms above her head as she walked to the window, looking out over the city. The world was still turning, the streets still bustling with life, and she realized that this too was a part of her new reality. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a symbol. She was just a woman, living her life on her own terms. The sky was turning a soft shade of purple, the last remnants of daylight slipping away. Mariah smiled faintly to herself. It was the smile of someone who had found their place in the world, not because the world had given it to them, but because they had taken it for themselves. She wasn't just living anymore. She was alive, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't need anything or anyone else to define who she was. The city stretched out before her, the streets glowing softly in the evening light, and Mariah took a deep breath. She had fought her battles. She had overcome her fears, and now the future was hers to create.